Montana Territory, February 1889. The most respected builder in Flathead Valley stood in front of a half-finished cabin and shook his head. "That thing," he said, pointing at the massive brick structure rising in the center of the room, "is the most dangerous, wasteful mistake I've seen in 30 years of construction." He wasn't alone. Neighbors passing by stopped to stare. Some laughed. Others whispered. A few just walked away, shaking their heads. The woman building it? She kept laying bricks. Today, you're going to understand why what the entire town called the worst idea became the most copied heating design in the Northern Rockies. You're going to see how a technique dismissed as ugly, impractical, and dangerous outperformed every conventional fireplace by a margin so wide it humiliated the experts. But more than that, you're going to learn a heating principle that worked when life and death hung on staying warm, and you're going to see the exact numbers that proved everyone wrong. Subscribe now, and every week I'll bring you one real technique from the frontier, methods that weren't theories, but survival tools tested by the harshest conditions imaginable. Now, let me show you what she understood that they didn't. The scene that February morning was almost theatrical. A woman in a wool coat and leather gloves, kneeling in frozen mud, laying brick after brick while men with decades of building experience stood at a distance, arms crossed, waiting for her to fail. Some had even started a betting pool at the saloon. How many weeks before she'd abandon the project and beg someone to build her a real fireplace? But here's what none of them knew. Elena wasn't experimenting. She wasn't guessing or hoping. She was replicating a technology that had kept Russian and Finnish families alive through Siberian winters for centuries. Winters that made Montana look mild. She'd grown up sleeping in a room heated by one of these stoves, where the fire was lit once in the morning and the house stayed warm until the next dawn. And she was about to prove that frontier American building wisdom had a blind spot the size of her 4,000-pound masonry heater. A blind spot that was costing families cords of wood, hours of labor, and in some cases, lives. Her name was Elena Dvorak, widow, mother of 3, homesteader on a 160-acre claim 8 miles south of Columbia Falls. She'd arrived from Eastern Europe 2 years earlier with her late husband. He'd died that first winter, pneumonia, the doctor said. But Elena knew better. Their cabin had been freezing. The standard open fireplace they'd built, the one everyone used, consumed wood faster than she could split it and still left the corners of the room cold enough to frost the inside walls. Her children had been sick constantly. She'd burned through cords of timber, and every morning she woke to ice on the water bucket. The system everyone swore by, it was failing her. Open fireplaces were the standard across Montana Territory. Simple to build, familiar, accepted, but they were hemorrhaging heat, sending 80% of the warmth straight up the chimney, while her children shivered 6 feet away from the flames. So Elena made a decision that would turn her into the subject of ridicule. She was going to build a Russian stove. A massive masonry heater she'd seen in her childhood village. A design that looked nothing like the stone fireplaces Montanans trusted. It would take up a quarter of her cabin's floor space. It would require thousands of pounds of brick and stone. It would have winding internal channels that made no sense to American builders. And it would cost her weeks of labor. The local builders told her it was suicide. "You'll suffocate," one said. "That thing will crack in the cold and burn your cabin down," said another. But Elena had lived through winters where a Russian stove kept a cottage warm for 18 hours after the fire died. She'd seen her grandmother's stove radiate heat from sunrise to sunset on a single morning load of wood. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. And there was something else driving her, something the men at the general store didn't understand. She'd watched her husband die because they couldn't keep the cabin warm enough. The doctor had written pneumonia on the death certificate, but Elena knew the truth. Their inadequate heating had weakened him, made him vulnerable, stolen his strength day by day until his body couldn't fight anymore. She made a promise over his grave. Her children would not suffer the same fate. They would not spend another winter shivering in a cabin that burned through their resources while delivering almost nothing in return. If that meant becoming the subject of town gossip, so be it. If it meant enduring mockery from men who claimed to know better, she'd endure it. Because here's what Elena understood that her critics didn't. Survival isn't about doing what's familiar. It's about doing what works. And the open fireplaces that Montana builders swore by, they weren't working. They were beautiful failures, impressive to look at, traditional in design, and thermodynamically catastrophic. Here's what Elena was building, and why it terrified the experts. A Russian stove, also called a masonry heater, isn't a fireplace. It's a heat battery. The firebox sits low and deep. You burn wood hot and fast, not the slow, all-day fires Montana cabins relied on. The flames and smoke don't go straight up a chimney. Instead, they travel through a labyrinth of internal channels, horizontal flues, vertical baffles, serpentine passages, all lined with firebrick and surrounded by thousands of pounds of stone or clay brick. As the hot gases wind through these channels, the massive walls absorb the heat. Not the flames, the heat itself. The masonry stores it the way a cast iron skillet stays hot long after you pull it off the stove. Then, for the next 12 to 24 hours, that mass radiates warmth into the room. Steady, even, silent. Elena's design called for roughly 4,200 pounds of sandstone and firebrick. The internal channels would add 18 feet of surface area for heat absorption. The outer walls would stay warm to the touch, never scalding, but consistently radiating at temperatures between 120 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. She positioned it in the center of the cabin so heat would radiate in all directions. No cold corners, no frozen back wall. But to American builders, it looked insane. "That's a fire hazard," said Martin Carpenter, the mason who'd built half the chimneys in the valley. "You're trapping smoke inside a pile of bricks. One crack, and you'll die of carbon monoxide poisoning." Others focused on the fuel. "You'll burn twice the wood heating all that stone," they said. "It's wasteful." And then there was the appearance. It was massive, blocky, and took up space. "That's not a cabin," one neighbor muttered. "That's a brick shed with a bed in it." Even the women in town looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "A real cabin has a hearth you can cook at, Elena. Not some oven in the middle of the room." But Elena had done the math. She'd planned for ventilation, small vents near the floor, a clean outdoor for ash, a damper system that sealed after combustion. She'd calculated the thermal mass, the draft, the clearance from the wood walls. She wasn't being reckless. She was being precise. The physics were simple, even if the execution was complex. A standard fireplace operates on convective heat. Hot air rises and escapes through the chimney, pulling cold air in from gaps around doors and windows. You're essentially heating the outdoors. The radiant heat you feel standing in front of the fire, that only extends about 4 feet. Beyond that, you're in the cold zone. Elena's Russian stove worked on an entirely different principle: radiant heat from stored thermal mass. The fire burned at extremely high temperatures, around 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant complete combustion, minimal smoke, and maximum heat transfer to the masonry. Those internal channels weren't decorative. They were heat exchangers, forcing the hot gases to give up their thermal energy before exiting through the chimney. By the time smoke left her stove, it was barely warm. What the critics saw as wasted space was actually the engine of efficiency. That 4,200 pounds of stone wasn't dead weight. It was a battery. Specific heat capacity of sandstone, approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Do the math. Her stove could store over 840 BTUs for every degree of temperature rise. When heated to 140 degrees Fahrenheit and allowed to cool to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it released nearly 60,000 BTUs of heat into the cabin. Slowly, evenly, for hours after the fire died. No Montana fireplace could compete with that. And deep down, the builders knew it. But admitting it would mean admitting they'd been building inefficient systems for decades. So instead, they attacked her credibility, her methods, her foreign design. They made it personal because they couldn't make it technical. By late January 1889, Elena's stove was finished. It sat in the center of her cabin like a cathedral of stone, imposing, strange, and utterly unlike anything her neighbors recognized. Martin Carpenter made his opinion clear at the general store. I give it 2 weeks before that thing cracks, smokes her out, or burns the whole cabin down. Mark my words, she'll be tearing it out by spring. Another builder, Joseph Ridley, was harsher. It's not just ugly, it's dangerous. I've been building chimneys for 20 years, and I'm telling you, trapping heat in mass like that is asking for a backdraft or a chimney fire. She's going to kill her kids. The women were quieter, but their judgment cut just as deep. It's not a home, one said to another while Elena stood 3 feet away at the post office. It's a coal bunker. No charm, no heart, just brick. Even the local reverend weighed in during Sunday service, without naming her directly. We must be wary, he said, of foreign customs that defy the wisdom our people have built through generations of survival in this land. Elena heard it all. She didn't argue. She just kept splitting wood, less than half of what her neighbors were stacking. Then, in the second week of February, the test arrived. A cold front swept down from Canada, what the Salish called a bone-breaker wind. Temperatures plunged to 19 degrees below zero. The wind tore through the valley at sustained speeds above 30 miles per hour, driving the wind chill down past 40 below. Cabins across Flathead started struggling immediately. Fireplaces that had been good enough were suddenly inadequate. People burned wood around the clock and still woke to ice on the inside of their windows. Some families moved their beds directly in front of the hearth. Others piled on every blanket they owned and still shivered through the night. With supplies that were supposed to last until March were gone in days. Children got sick. Elders couldn't get warm. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was medically dangerous. And Elena? She lit her stove once in the morning. 1 load of wood. Burned hot for 90 minutes. Then let go out. Her neighbors thought she'd given up. Stay with me, because what happened next humiliated the correct method so badly that the entire valley had to face the truth. The storm wasn't just cold. It was personal. The kind of cold that finds every gap, every weakness, every flaw in your shelter. The kind that turns a poorly insulated cabin into a death trap. Families who'd been comfortable, or at least surviving, suddenly found themselves in crisis mode. At the Gunderson place, 2 miles north, they were burning fence posts because they'd run out of split wood. The Mercer family moved everyone into one room and hung blankets over the doorway to trap what little heat their fireplace produced. Old Henrik Paulson, the Norwegian homesteader who'd survived winters in Trondheim, later admitted he'd seriously considered abandoning his claim and moving into town until the cold broke. And the wood. God, the wood. People were going through their winter stores at 3 times the normal rate. A core that should have lasted 2 weeks was gone in 4 days. Men were out in 30 below temperatures, trying to split frozen logs that shattered like glass. Women were feeding furniture into fires, chairs, crates, anything that would burn. The valley was in survival mode, and the method everyone had trusted was failing spectacularly. 3 days into the cold snap, a neighbor named William Ash knocked on Elena's door to check on her. He expected to find her huddled under blankets, maybe burning furniture to stay alive. Instead, he walked into a cabin that felt like mid-autumn. He stood there, stunned. Outside, the wind howled at 22 below zero. Inside Elena's cabin, the temperature held steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The children were playing on the floor in shirt sleeves. No fire burning, no smoke, just warmth, radiating from the massive stone structure in the center of the room. William touched the stove. Warm, not hot, warm, like sun-baked rock in July. When did you last light it? He asked. This morning, Elena said. Around 6. It was now past 2 in the afternoon. 8 hours. No fire. And the cabin was still warmer than his had been, with a roaring blaze going all night. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, people started measuring. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't believe it. Elena's cabin, 68 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature during the coldest stretch of the winter. Her neighbors with standard fireplaces, averaging 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was with fires burning constantly. The difference? 76 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the coldest cabins in the valley. But the temperature wasn't the only shock. Wood consumption. Elena burned 1 load per day, roughly 30 pounds of split pine and larch. Her neighbors were burning 80 to 120 pounds per day just to keep their cabins marginally livable. Elena used 65% less wood and stayed warmer. Heat retention. After the fire went out, her stove continued radiating measurable warmth for 18 to 22 hours. Conventional fireplaces? The room started cooling within an hour of the fire dying. One family tried to replicate the experiment. They stacked extra wood, kept their fire roaring, even closed off part of their cabin to concentrate the heat. Best they managed, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Still 14 degrees colder than Elena's cabin with no fire burning. The data was undeniable. The Russian stove wasn't just different, it was devastatingly more efficient. And the critics? They went quiet. Martin Carpenter, the mason who'd predicted disaster, showed up at Elena's door in early March. He didn't apologize, but he asked if she'd walk him through the internal channel design. Joseph Ridley, the builder who'd called it dangerous, never admitted he was wrong. But by the following autumn, he was advertising European masonry heater installation as a service. The proof wasn't in words. It was in numbers, degrees, pounds of wood, hours of radiant heat. And in a place where winter could kill you, numbers like that didn't lie. But perhaps the most telling detail came from Elena's children. While other families in the valley were bundling kids in layers of wool and keeping them close to the fire, Elena's 3 children were playing on the floor in normal clothes. The youngest, 4 years old, was barefoot. In February, during the worst cold snap in a decade, William Ash noticed this immediately. "Aren't you worried about them catching cold?" he asked. Elena just smiled. "Feel the floor," she said. He knelt down and pressed his palm against the wooden planks. Warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm. The radiant heat from the stove was warming the floor itself, rising through the cabin in gentle waves. There are no cold spots, no frozen corners, no icy drafts along the baseboards. Compare that to standard cabins, where you could literally see your breath if you stepped 6 feet away from the fireplace, where children slept in coats, where frost formed on nails protruding through the interior walls. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between merely surviving winter and actually living through it with dignity and comfort. And here's the number that really drove it home. Fuel efficiency per degree of comfort. Elena was achieving 68 degrees Fahrenheit of sustained warmth using 30 pounds of wood per day. Her neighbors were achieving 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit using 100 pounds per day. That's not just better efficiency. That's a completely different category of technology. It's the difference between a candle and an oil lamp, between a dugout canoe and a sailboat. The Russian stove didn't just beat the competition. It obliterated it. And the evidence was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even the proudest builders in the valley had to swallow their words and admit they'd been wrong. By spring of 1889, something remarkable had happened in Flathead Valley. The ugly brick structure that had been the subject of mockery 6 months earlier had become the most discussed building technique in the region. It started quietly. A homesteader named Robertson showed up at Elena's door in March with a notebook and a measuring tape. He didn't announce himself as a convert. He just asked if he could examine the internal channel design. Elena walked him through it. 2 weeks later, he started building his own version 15 miles east. Then came the Swinson brothers, who'd lost half their winter wood supply during the February cold snap. They didn't ask permission. They just started constructing a smaller version in their bunkhouse, using Elena's cabin as a template they'd sketched from memory. By summer, the shift was undeniable. Martin Carpenter, the mason who'd publicly predicted Elena's stove would crack, smoke her out, or burn the whole cabin down, was now offering masonry heater construction as a premium service. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge he'd been wrong. He just quietly started building them, charging double his normal rate because the design requires specialized knowledge. Joseph Ridley, the builder who'd called it dangerous, went further. He traveled to Helena and consulted with a Finnish stonemason who'd emigrated the year before. By autumn, Ridley had built 3 masonry heaters for wealthy clients in Kalispell. He called them Alpine heating systems, and marketed them as innovations in frontier technology. The irony wasn't lost on Elena, but the real transformation happened at the community level. Families who'd watched their neighbors struggle through February while Elena's cabin stayed warm began asking questions. Not confrontational questions, curious ones. How much brick did you use? Where does the smoke go? How long does the heat last? The women were especially interested. They'd spent years managing fires, splitting kindling, feeding logs, cleaning ash, keeping flames alive through the night. The idea of lighting one fire in the morning and being done for the day, that wasn't just efficiency. That was freedom. By the winter of 1890, just 2 years after Elena finished her stove, 11 cabins and homesteads within a 30-mile radius had incorporated some version of masonry heater design. Not all were pure Russian stoves. Some were hybrids, traditional fireplaces with added thermal mass. Others were scaled-down versions built into existing structures. But they all shared the same principle. Store heat in mass, release it slowly, and stop burning your resources just to heat the outdoors. The technique didn't spread through advertising or formal instruction. It spread the way all survival knowledge spreads on the frontier, through observation, necessity, and the quiet acknowledgement that someone had figured out something that worked better than what everyone else was doing. And here's the phrase that started circulating around Flathead Valley, repeated in general stores and trading posts and Sunday gatherings. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being practical. It was a small sentence, but it carried weight, because it meant the community had stopped seeing Elena as a strange widow with foreign ideas and started seeing her as someone who'd understood something fundamental that they'd missed. The Russian stove became known locally as the Dvorak heater, a name that stuck for decades. By 1895, a territorial survey noted that masonry heaters had become increasingly common in northern Montana settlements, particularly in areas with harsh winters and limited timber access. What had been dismissed as ugly, wasteful, and dangerous had become standard practice. Not because anyone forced it, not because of regulations or mandates, but because winter is an honest teacher. It doesn't care about your pride, your traditions, or your assumptions. It only cares about what works. And Elena's stove worked. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that goes beyond masonry and BTUs and thermal mass. The frontier was full of people who claimed expertise based on familiarity. They'd built the same structures the same way for years, and they mistook repetition for mastery. When someone came along with a different approach, especially someone who didn't fit their expectations of who should have valuable knowledge, their first instinct was dismissal. Elena's critics didn't evaluate her design on its merits. They evaluated it based on whether it matched their existing worldview. And when it didn't, they assumed it was wrong. This wasn't malicious. It was human. But it was also dangerous because it meant they were locked into methods that were measurably inferior, burning more resources, delivering less comfort, and in some cases, putting lives at risk. The wisdom Elena brought wasn't new. Russian and Finnish communities have been building masonry heaters for centuries. The technology was proven, but to Montana builders in 1889, it looked alien, and alien meant suspect. Here's what they missed. Ancient techniques aren't primitive. They're refined. They're the result of generations of people solving the same problems you're facing, testing solutions in conditions where failure meant death, and passing down only what actually worked. When Elena built that stove, she wasn't experimenting. She was applying centuries of accumulated knowledge to a new landscape. And the fact that it looked different, that it didn't match the local aesthetic, that it required more initial labor, none of that changed the fundamental truth that it was a superior technology. The real transformation in Flathead Valley wasn't just that people started building masonry heaters. It was that they started questioning their assumptions about what the right way looked like. They learned that efficiency doesn't always look familiar, that the best solution isn't always the traditional one, that someone from outside your community might understand something about survival that you don't, not because they're smarter, but because they're drawing on a different body of tested knowledge. And most importantly, that mockery is often just fear of being wrong, dressed up as confidence. Today, if you visit Montana, you'll still find masonry heaters in old homesteads. Some are original structures from the 1890s, still functional, still radiating heat the way they did over a century ago. They're not historical curiosities. They're working tools, testament to a technology that outlasted the skepticism that tried to kill it. Elena Dvorak died in 1923, 34 years after finishing her stove. She never became famous. She never wrote a book or gave lectures. But her cabin stayed warm every winter for decades, using a fraction of the wood her neighbors burned. And that's the real measure of wisdom. Not whether people applaud you, but whether your solution still works long after the critics are silent. So here's my question for you. Which part of this solution would you apply in your home today? Maybe it's not a full masonry heater. Maybe it's just the principle: store heat instead of constantly generating it. Use thermal mass. Designed for efficiency, not just tradition. Question whether this standard method is actually the best method or just a familiar one. And maybe, just maybe, when someone shows you a technique that looks strange or foreign or impractical, you pause before dismissing it. Because the person building that ugly structure might understand something about survival that you don't. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? I want to hear your stories. And if this story changed how you think about old techniques, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one real method from the frontier, technologies that weren't theories, but survival tools tested by the harshest conditions imaginable. Because the past isn't primitive. It's proven. And sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is listen to someone who's already solved the problem you're facing, even if their solution looks nothing like what you expected. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.